Section 20 of The Lost Oases by Ahmad Muhammad Hassanayn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Journey's End. Sleep came slowly to me that first night in Furuwiyah. I was excited, as I had not been since saying goodbye to Lieutenant Bather at Sollum and beginning the journey. Now I was in touch again with the outside world, and the journey was really over, even though it would still be a month or more before I could exchange my caravan for other methods of travel. The lost oases of Arkanu and Oanat were no longer lost, and if my observations proved to be as accurate as I hoped they were, a good map could now be made of this strip of the Libyan desert from Jallo to Furuwiyah. We spent 3 full days at Furuwiyah getting used to the damp climate we had come into and trying to get enough to eat to keep us from feeling miserable. Dark clouds hovered over our heads much of the time, and every day it rained. My men gorged themselves with mutton, but the lack of sugar for the tea and other provisions rather took the edge off their enjoyment of these feasts. On June 6th, we started south in the afternoon and climbed slowly out of the valley. We passed many flocks of sheep and cattle going home, followed by slim girls and boys clad in nothing but a loincloth or strings of beads. It was quite different from the desert we had come through. We were following a beaten track and passing frequently small villages of straw huts, women carrying hatab, and other signs of habitation. Near one of the villages, I told the caravan to go ahead and pointed out to them where we would camp. I followed with my horse. There were a few points of interest geographically, and I had to take some observations. As I was nearing the camp, I heard the voices curiously upraised, a mixture between men wailing and singing. My first thought was that some of the men of the caravan had got into trouble with the natives. I spurred on my horse, and as I was approaching the camp, my mind was relieved, for I heard the tom-tom of the drum and women's voices singing. It was just after sunset, and in the dusk I could not distinguish clearly the crowd that was moving toward me, but soon one of my men came rushing up to tell me that they had had the most cordial reception from the men and women of the village, who insisted on coming out to receive the sheik of the caravan. He had hardly broken this news to me when a bevy of young girls, some singing, others dancing, surrounded my horse, who responded as befitted a Bedouin horse and started prancing. The women raised luliyas, and I was urged by my Bedouins to empty gunpowder. The crowd made way for my horse, and I walked him off a short distance, turned around, came rushing back, and pulled him up dead. By that time I had got out my rifle, and as my horse stopped dead, I fired my shot in Bedouin fashion at the feet of the first row of beautiful damsels. They were half frightened and half delighted. Then 6 of them surrounded the horse, circling round me, and gave me the shabal. That is to say, with a sudden twist of the head, they whirled their tresses toward me, as a woman of southern Europe might throw a rose. In response, I put my finger on each girl's forehead, and holding my rifle high in the air, twirled it around her head, crying, "Abshir bil Kir," rejoice in the bounty of God. We then formed ourselves into a procession and proceeded to the camp. The moment they saw me coming, surrounded by all those girls, the Bedouins fired in the air in honor of the occasion. The Bedouin is very chivalrous, and such is his idea of honoring the ladies. Afterward I distributed scent to all the girls, who went away very happy, and it was a most cheerful evening in the camp. The next day we reached Umburu, 38 kilometers from Furuwiyah. We camped near the well, and the next morning I was awakened early by sounds of cattle and sheep coming to water. An hour later a busy market was being held alongside our camp. We had unwittingly pitched our tents close by the big tree that marked the center of the marketplace. Only women took part in the market, bringing butter, leather, mats, maize, cotton, and salt, which they bartered with each other without the use of money. Meanwhile, the men lay about at their ease and did nothing. As I watched such a scene as this, and others not unlike, in the villages of the Sudan, I found myself wondering whether the black women were not, after all, better off as slaves in a Bedouin household. Here they do all the work that is done, caring for cattle and sheep, doing the housework, and preparing meals and making the favorite beverage marissa for their men, carrying on the business of the market, everything. As slaves, they would have only certain circumscribed duties and some opportunity for leisure. As I turned this over in my mind, however, I seemed to catch something in the sound of their talk and their laughter that slaves do not have. Perhaps there is something in the feeling of liberty, after all, even when it is accompanied by drudgery. We stopped at Umburu for 2 days. Abdel Rahman Jedu, Wakil of Mohammedan, the head of the Saghawa tribe, visited me and brought sheep and chicken as diafa. On the 2nd day we were given an official welcome, the Wakil coming with a retinue of retainers on horseback, beating drums. Mohammedan's family, in the absence of the master of the household, sent a lunch of asida, vegetables, marissa, and pastry. The next stage of our journey was a 5 days' trek to Kuttum, 129 kilometers to the southward. The weather was generally good, though hot, with an occasional shower. We traveled as usual in the early morning and late afternoon. There was a beaten track with fairly good going, through hilly country covered with dry grass and small trees. At intervals there were patches which had been burnt in preparation for being cultivated. On the 3rd day my messenger to El Fasher arrived with 2 companions, but it was a disappointing meeting. It had taken him 5 days instead of 4 to reach his destination, and he had not brought the answer to my letter back with him. It was waiting for me, he said, in the possession of a soldier at Mutarig Well, 12 hours' journey from where we were. The soldier also had provisions for us, but they did us little immediate good at that distance. There was little for dinner when we camped that night. After dinner I sent our guide off post-haste with orders to ride all night until he reached Mutarig. There he was to tell the soldier to come to us as fast as he could. We started before 4 the next morning, and in an hour the men came rushing to me with the news that there was a soldier ahead on a camel. In a few minutes I had a letter from Charles Dupuy, acting governor of Darfur, in the absence of Saville Pasha, who had resigned from the service, and a small supply of rice, flour, teas, and sugar. I was especially pleased to be handed a supply of cigarettes. I had not smoked since soon after leaving Urdi. At Uanat I had suddenly realized that there were only a few cigarettes left. I then laid down a strict rule for myself, 1 cigarette a day after dinner. It was hard work, waiting all day for that brief smoke, but it was worth it when the moment came. I would get into a sheltered corner, light the precious cigarette, and shield it carefully from any breath of wind that might make it burn ever so slightly faster. When the few cigarettes were gone, there was nothing left but memories and expectation. Now, at last, the expectation was gratified with a vengeance, for I smoked until my throat was sore. Bukhara, with a handful of the newly arrived cigarettes, put on his long-tasseled red tarbouche, got on the guide's horse, and did a little fantasia of joy. But it was when we camped at the government rest house at Maharig that general rejoicing broke loose, with singing and dancing. The corporal, looking on while the men set the sugar loaf on the ground and executed a wild dance about it, thought us all a little mad. "Why all this rejoicing?" he demanded. "Because for a month we have had no sugar, and now our tea is sweetened again," said Abdullahi. Until one has tried going without any sugar whatever, one does not realize how keenly it will be missed. The corporal shook his head and smiled. "I must return at once to Kuttum and bring you more provisions," he said. "We never realized that you were so short of food." Before he left, he was kind enough to go to a camp nearby and bring us a sheep and butter, which were to be paid for by the Moawin of Kuttum, since the seller refused to accept Egyptian paper money. The corporal then left with letters from me for Mr. Dupuy and the Moawin, the deputy governor of Khartoum. The provisions which he had brought us were good as far as they went, but we should very soon be in need of more. I decided to push on at once. We made our midday halt at the government rest house at Maharigwell, and our stop for the night only a few kilometers farther on. The camels were in very bad condition. The backs and sides of some of them were sore and bleeding, and 2 camels refused to move until their loads were taken off. It rained for an hour that evening, but it could not dampen our spirits. The men sang and danced around a big fire. The humidity and the smell of the wet grass reminded me of my walks in English country. We made an early start the next morning in order to reach Mutarig well for the midday halt. We lunched at the rest house near the well and received a visit from the Sheikh of Mutarig, who brought a few chickens as diafa. He wanted us to stop the night so he could entertain us properly the next day, but I felt the necessity of going on as fast as possible. The camels were getting steadily worse. We had to leave one of them with the sheik of the village on the understanding that if it recovered he was to get a quarter of the price it brought when sold, while if it died he was not to be held responsible. An hour and a half after starting the next day, another soldier on horseback appeared. He brought a letter from the Moawin of Khartoum and a small quantity of rice and sugar. They are gratefully received, for once more we were on short rations and without sugar for our tea. I gave him a letter to take back to Khartoum. A little later we camped in the small valley of Boa. In the afternoon, soon after we had started again, it came on to rain with a strong southeast wind, and I thought it might be wise to camp until the storm was over. But through my glasses I made out ahead of us a row of straw huts of the Marcus, the government house of Khartoum, and spurred on by the sight, we drove the camels faster. Soon a group of horsemen were seen approaching us, and my Bedouins impulsively raised a cheer. When I recognized the uniform of Sudanese troops, it was the most cheering sight that I had seen for many weeks. Riyad Abu Akla Effendi and Nasser el-Din Shaddad Effendi, the 2 Moawins of Khartoum, approached with a detachment of 10 soldiers, the Cadi, the head clerk, and other officials and notables of Khartoum. I shook hands warmly with them all, and under their escort the caravan moved on through the village. As we approached, the Marcus women, clothed in white and beating drums, greeted us with singing and lulias. We settled ourselves in and about the rest house, and the women came again to offer greetings. In a long line they sang and danced, much to the delight of my Bedouins, who asked permission to empty gunpowder in acknowledgment of the courtesy. I could not refuse my consent, and one by one, beginning with Bukhara, the men performed the ceremony of singeing the girls' slippers. The Sudanese women were not so accustomed to the Bedouin manner of paying homage as the girls of the northern desert, and flinched a little as the powder flashed at their feet. But they accepted it all in good part, the whole line swaying and dancing to the rhythm of the drums, while one of my men singled them out for the slipper-singeing honor. It was a wonderful reception, and the pleasure of it dispersed like magic the fatigue and lassitude of the journey. More hospitality was to come. 4 sheep, butter, and fresh vegetables, to say nothing of sugar, were brought to us as diafa from the Moawins and officials, and we spent a pleasant evening feasting. Our arrival at Khartoum at this particular moment had seemed to the inhabitants there an especially auspicious one, for we came with the first rain of the season. We stopped there for 2 days, entertained generously by the Moawins in the absence of the inspector, Mr. Arkell, who was at El Fasher. One afternoon we attended a soccer match between 2 teams of soldiers. It was played with energy, if not finesse. At times a player, striving to give the ball an especially vigorous kick, would miss it and send his Sudanese slipper shooting high into the air. The camaraderie between officers and men, playing this not exactly gentle game together, was interesting to see. Dinner that night with Riyad Effendi and Nasser el-Din Effendi, the Mullawans, was the first meal I had eaten in a house since leaving Kufra. My host gave me Egyptian newspapers to read, the first I had seen in nearly 6 months. We left Kurum at 6 o'clock in the morning of June 17th, cheered by the generous hospitality we had enjoyed and the friendly send-off our friends gave us. The 2 days' journey to El Fasher was a joyride. We all felt the thrill and exhilaration of getting in touch with the world again. But as I went to bed on the 18th, I realized with a stab of regret that this was my last day in the real desert. I thought how I should miss my men and my camels, the desolateness and the beauty, the solitude and the companionship. In 2 words, the desert and its life. I thanked God for his guidance across this vast expanse of pathless sand, and found myself adding a prayer, half wistfully, that I might come back to it again. I had given orders for an early start the next morning. In their eagerness, my men somewhat exaggerated my idea of early, but I was excited myself and did not mind getting under way at 2:30. 3 hours' march from El Fasher, we camped to make preparations for entering the place. We all shaved and put on our best clothes. Mr. Dupuy had sent a supply of white cloth to Kurum for us, and my men were able to appear once more in decent raiment. They crowded around my remnant of a mirror to see how they looked. Rifles were cleaned, and the luggage, which was in a very shabby state, was tidied as much as possible. I wished that I might be able to do something for the camels as well, which were thin and dejected looking, but rest and attention to their sore backs were what they needed, and we had no time or facilities for giving them that. Nevertheless, they too seemed to be infected with the spirit of eagerness felt by all of us, and walked forward briskly. Abdullahi and Zerwali got into their silks, and the caravan moved gaily toward its destination. As we reached the outskirts of El Fasher, cheers of rejoicing arose throughout the caravan. A cavalcade of men in khaki was coming toward us. I put spurs to Baraka, and he responded willingly. He saw the horses before us, pricked his ears forward, and dashed toward them. Mr. Dupuy came forward on his horse to meet me, and we shook hands warmly. The greetings were repeated by the English and Egyptian officers of his staff, and we went on to his house, a part of which he generously made over to me and the men of my caravan. The weary camels were promptly taken in hand by Bimbashi Andas, who gave them food, water, and the medical treatment for their wounds they so much needed. The officer in charge of the wireless station kindly got me the exact Greenwich time from Paris by radio. I was pleased to discover that my chronometer had lost only 23 minutes and 23 seconds in 8 months. For 10 days I was the guest of Mr. Dupuy, and was lavishly entertained by the officers and officials of the garrison, both English and my own compatriots, and the notables of the town. Hospitality was showered upon me, and every kind of assistance that could possibly be needed was eagerly rendered. This was civilization again. I enjoyed once more the luxuries of life, especially vegetables and fruits. It is only when one has gone through the austere regime of the desert that one looks upon these things as luxuries and not necessities. There was, in particular, a brand of prunes, the pride of Major Smith and of peculiar lusciousness. He called them "if winter comes," and I have never tasted their like anywhere. At last the day came when I must take leave of my companions of the trek from Kufra. When Bukhara and his brother and Hamid and Sunusi Bujaber came to my room to say goodbye, it was a moment full of real emotion and crowded with memories. These rugged men of the desert burst into tears, and I found my own eyes wet. We had been through thick and thin together, and came out fast friends. I could never wish for better companions on a journey into desolate regions, more able, more manly, or more loyal. We read the Fatiha, the sound of the familiar sacred phrases punctuated by Bukhara's sobbing. I exchanged a final handclasp with each of them, and we parted, to meet one day, I hope, in that desert that I love as much as they. One more camel trek before me eastward to El Obeid. There I took train for Khartoum, and thence home to Cairo, where I arrived on August 1st, 1923. I had been away from home 7 months and 23 days, having trekked 2,200 miles across the desert by caravan. I had determined, finally, the position of the Zigan Wells and of Kufra on the map of Africa, in the placings of which there had been hitherto errors of 100 and 45 kilometers respectively. I had also had the great good fortune to put the lost oases of Arkanu and Uweinat definitely on the map of the Libyan desert. To A.M.H. I crave no statue in a public street, nor page of history to give my name. A desert flower on my winding sheet is all I ask to mark the way I came. There were no jewels buried in the sand. The treasure that I sought was little worth. I went, but oh, how few will understand, to tread an unworn carpet of the earth. Wide spaces called me, and the way was free. Feet falter not upon a road unknown. How languish one who, looking back, can see 1,000 miles, no footsteps but his own. Not 100 voyagings for gold could make me rich, as many times I've been, when, weary-eyed, I've watched the dawn unfold and spread soft radiance o'er a desert scene. Thoughts were my treasure. Where may thoughts be sold? My world was empty, but my world was clean. G. F. Foley, El Fasher, June 30th, 1923. End of section 20. Read by Stephen Seidel. End of The Lost Oases by Ahmad Muhammad Hassanayn.